The Senate will be returning from its recess in just a few minutes to continue work on whether to move forward on a measure dealing with the National Labor Relations Board rules for union elections. The senators will hold a procedural vote very shortly.
To proceed to SJ Res 36. The question is on the motion.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, we're going to have a bunch of votes today, and we're going to have to do them quickly. I say this to Democrats, I say it to Republicans. We're going to have, after this first vote, I ask consent that we have 10-minute votes.
That is the order.
And we're going to enforce that. So if people aren't here, you're going to miss a vote. It's going to, and unless there's a situation where we have a really close vote, then we'll extend a little bit, because that's what the tradition has been here. So I repeat, everybody be here or you're going to miss a vote if you're not here at the end of the time. Ask for the ayes and nays on this matter.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander.
Okay. I like it.
Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckidge. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown in Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. DeMette. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein.
After this is done.
That is my understanding. But people have to. I don't think it's the only vote for right now. I've come pretty close. I'm pretty sure that we're going to be having a lot of votes.
Starting now.
Starting now. You could ask Meredith.
Yeah.
She doesn't care about my life.
Mr. Franken.
Thank you much.
Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin.
Aye.
Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Joe Hans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Carey, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg,
Don't ask. Vote.
Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Bozeman, Burr, Coates, Coburn, Collins, Crapo, Dement, Enzi, Graham, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Johans, Lugar, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, and Sessions. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Beckidge, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Conrad, Feinstein, Franken, Hagan, Harkin, Carey, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Lieberman, Manchin, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Sanders, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Isaacson, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, aye. Mr. Noe, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Rockefeller, no. Mr. Bingaman, no. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Webb, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Udall of Colorado, no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, no. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, no. Mr. Baucus, no. Mr. Pryor, no.
Well, you can't enter a motion to read it. Yeah, I think you
Mr.
should-
Blunt, aye. Mr. Bennett, no.
Well,
Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye.
You're going to have people lined up to call for amendments that are not passing?
Mr. McCain.
Yes, I do.
Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye.
All of it.
Hutchison. Mrs. Hutcherson, aye. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Vitter, aye. Ms. Snow, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Nelson of Florida, no. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Durbin, no. Mrs. McCaskill, no.
Waiting for Reed to get out.
Mr. Thune, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber still wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not on this, the yeas are 45, the nays are 54. The motion is not agreed to.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask consent that we now resume consideration of the post office bill.
I hear the Majority Leader.
Majority Leader.
I said under the previous order, I asked that we resume consideration of the postal bill.
Is there objection?
There's no objection.
Mr.
Under the
President,
previous order, the clerk will report the pending business.
Calendar number 296, a 1789, a bill to improve, sustain, and transform the United States Postal Service.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, I appreciate the good work of our colleagues on this legislation. Unfortunately, the legislation spends $34 billion, all of which would be borrowed, all of which adds to the debt of the United States and is contrary to the Budget Control Act limitations that was passed just last August. It's really a grievous problem, not one that can be avoided lightly.
Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, it's a very grievous problem. Just last August, we agreed to certain debt limits, the amount of debt we would incur and add to the United States Treasury. And it was a fought-over agreement, but we reached it and we stood by it. And we, I believe, have a moral obligation to not mislead the people who elected us when we said we intend to stay by the limits on increasing debt. This bill increases debt above that limit. The Congressional Budget Office scores it as adding $34 billion in debt to the United States. Chairman Conrad has certified a budget point of order is legitimately placed against it. If I would expect we would have a motion to waive the budget point of order. I would expect there might be a motion to say, well, we don't agree with the CBO, or somehow this is so important we need to add to the debt anyway. But colleagues, if we mean what we say, if this time in history we began to at least stay within the limits we agreed, and we don't do that, then I think we have lost further credibility with the American people. So I don't, I respect the work of the colleagues on the bill, but I think we're setting a great precedent here, a matter of importance for our own integrity and the fiscal stability of America, and I believe it's important that we adhere to that limit. So, Mr. President, the pending measure, Amendment 2000 to S. 1789, the 21st Century Postal Service Act, would violate Senate pay-go rule and increase the deficit. Therefore, I raise a point of order against this measure pursuant to Section 201A of S-Con Res 21, the concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2008.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
I thank the Chair. Mr. President, pursuant to Section 904 of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 and the waiver provisions of applicable budget resolutions, I move to waive all applicable sections of the Act and budget resolutions for purposes of the pending amendment for reasons that we described in the debate that we had here on the floor yesterday. The U.S. Postal Service says this bill will in fact save $19 billion a year. And I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? It appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Vote on this motion to waive be placed at the end of the list of amendments that are in order to vote on now.
I would object, Mr. President.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President, if I may, if we're going to vote now, and Senator Collins and I spoke to this at great length yesterday, the CBO score that my friend from Alabama cites is a real misreading of the effect of this legislation. It's a kind of form of accounting over the reality of budgeting, and the bottom line is that the U.S. Postal Service itself...
President, the Senate is not in order.
Senate will be in order.
I thank the Chair. The U.S. Postal Service itself says that if this bill, Substitute Senate Bill 1789, is adopted, and it will be phased in over 3 years. The Postal Service will save $19 billion annually. To me, that's what this is all about. No deficit, a saving. I ask my colleagues to support the motion to waive the point of order. I would yield to my ranking member for further statement.
Mr. President, the score for the substitute is incredibly misleading. As the Postal Service has told us, this bill would save the Postal Service $19 billion, and that would return it to profitability. The problem is the unique status of the Postal Service in that it is off budget for operations but on budget for workers' benefits accounts. This is true despite the fact that these accounts that the Postal Service pays into are not funded with tax dollars. The postal employees are contributing. The Postal Service, from its revenue, is contributing. Mr. President, could we have order, please?
The Senate will be in order. Senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. For the retirement account, we are not talking about tax dollars from the Postal Service. These are contributions from the postal employees and by the Postal Service from its revenues. But because of the unified budget, it is considered to be an on-budget status for these benefit accounts, most likely because they're shared with other federal agencies that are using tax dollars. So I urge my colleagues to vote for the motion to waive. If they do not, and this bill falls, it will spell the end of the Postal Service.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Very briefly, I join my colleague in saying that if this point of order by our friend from Alabama is sustained and this bipartisan bill, therefore, is not able to be brought up, the effect will be that the Post Office will continue to run ever greater surpluses to a point where they, in fact, will have to turn to the Treasury, which they're not doing now, to bail them out. This is a responsible answer to a problem, and a bipartisan one. I urge my colleagues to vote to support the motion to waive the gentleman's point of order. I would yield to the Senator from Delaware.
Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, can we have order, please? Colleagues, I hope you'll listen to what Senator Collins said with respect to the way this has been scored. It's a very, very important point. As much as anybody in this chamber, I'm interested in reducing budget deficits, as much as anybody. And I just want you to keep in mind maybe these three points. One, for a number of years, the Postal Service has overpaid its obligation into the federal employee retirement system. $12 to $13 billion overpayment. They're owed that money. They should be given that money. They're going to use that money to help 100,000 postal employees eligible to retire. They're going to use that money to pay down their debt, $13 billion of debt, almost wipe it out. They're going to use that money for this purpose. CBO scores that as something that makes the budget deficit bigger. Well, if they've overpaid the money into the federal employee retirement system, they ought to get it back. And they shouldn't just waste it. They should use it to get people who are eligible to retire, who want to retire. They should use it to pay down a $12 billion line of credit to the federal government. One. Second point I want to make, great point offered by Senator Lieberman. If we do nothing, we get to May 15th, the Postmaster General, the Postal Service is free to close post offices across the country, 3,700 of them. They're free to close as many as 200 to 300 mail processing centers across the country. We think there's a smarter way to do it, and it's in this legislation. The last point I'd like to make is we're going to have the opportunity over today and tomorrow for for all of us to better understand the amendments that have been agreed to, offered by both sides, what's been agreed to, what's been folded into the matters amendment, and to actually have a score that, frankly, I have a lot more confidence in, and that's from the Postal Service themselves. The Postal Service tells us today they're going to lose $23 million. They lost that much yesterday. They're going to lose that much again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. They owe $13 billion to the Treasury. And what I think is the more important number for us to keep in mind is when we finish our work here today and tomorrow, look to see what does that mean for the Postal Service in terms of their operating deficit on a daily basis, and where are they going to be in terms of repaying their obligation to the Treasury by 2016. That's where we should keep our eye on the ball. And I would urge you not to vote for this. Give us a day and a day to work our will, for the body to work as well, then make your decision. If we've not made any more progress, vote against it. And the last thing I'd say, there's a bunch of our colleagues, well-intentioned, not a bunch, several of our colleagues, well-intentioned amendments that are literally going to drive up the cost and make it harder for the Postal Service to move toward a balanced situation, to a solvent situation. I would urge you, some of these amendments are offered by people that frankly we love, and it's hard to say no to them. In this case, I would consider that maybe the greater devotion should be to the taxpayers of our country, the people who work for the Postal Service, and their customers. Thank you very much.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, I really appreciate our senators who've expressed their disagreement on the budget point of order. But even if you disagreed over the $11 billion, there's $23 billion additional spending that's borrowed, will be borrowed over the decade, according to CBO. And with regard to the $11 billion, that money will be borrowed and given to the Postal Service. It increases the debt of the United States, and therefore CBO scores it as a violation of the debt limit in the pay-go provision. It clearly is. So we are not saying you shouldn't have a postal bill. Let's vote. Let's stand firm with the debt limit agreement we had in August. Let's ask our good committee to produce a bill that's paid for in some fashion. We spend $3,700 billion in this United States of America. We'd need to find about $3 billion a year to fund their proposal to solve this problem. That's what we should do. We're at a defining moment. There's no middle ground. I say vote to sustain the point of order.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, for a very long time now, in a bipartisan way, a number of people have come together to save the United States Postal Service. And Senator Lieberman and Senator Carper and Senator Collins and Senator Brown have worked very hard. Many of others have worked very hard, because if the Postal Service goes under or is dismembered, we are talking about 8 million jobs in this country, small business people who are dependent on a strong Postal Service. Postmaster General originally was talking about shutting down 3,700 rural post offices in every state in this country. And I hope that members understand that a post office in a rural town is more than just a post office. That post office disappears. In many cases, that town disappears. Postmaster General was talking about significantly slowing mail delivery standards, shutting down half of the processing plants in this country, and over a short period of time, eliminating 200,000 jobs in this country over a short period of time. So I would hope that we could proceed, have a serious debate on these issues, hear all of the amendments, but at the end of the day, I would hope that we will go forward and save the United States Postal Service.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I too want to thank the two lead, the chairman and the ranking member of this committee, for bringing something to the floor, and Senator Carper, for bringing something to the floor that's bipartisan, and I applaud that, and I applaud the fact that the committee process is working. But the fact is, we did set a top-line number when the country was almost shut down last August the 2nd. And in one of the very first pieces of legislation that we passed, the highway bill, we violated that budget cap. Now, it wasn't by much, but we violated it. Now we have a bill that violates it by $34 billion. And what I would say is, if the post office is that important to this nation, if it has bipartisan support, shouldn't we figure out a way to deal with the post office in such a way to stay within the budget constraints that we've laid out? It seems to me that things that are very popular in this nation are the very things that we ought to make choices about and eliminate something else if we want to spend money in this way. Now, I'd like to see a bill that's far more reformed, and I think if we did that, the tab on this would not be $34 billion above the budget. But what I would say to everyone here, please, I mean, our credibility is going out the window. 64 of us signed a letter to the leader and to the president asking that we deal in a real way with deficit reduction. The country almost shut down. The world watched. We established a top-line number. And here we are, for something that we like, we're violating that. We're losing all credibility with our citizens, the citizens that we represent. We're losing credibility in the world. And to me, if you're going to produce a bipartisan piece of legislation, it ought to be one that lives within the bipartisan agreement that we had regarding what we're going to spend in this nation. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I want to add my strong voice to support the Lieberman, Collins, Carper position, and Senator Brown has also been a great leader in this bipartisan effort to save the post office and put it on a more sound financial footing, not at the expense of taxpayers generally, but the users of the post office. This is about rural towns in America. This is about small businesses everywhere that rely on the post office to get basic business done. Don't vote wrong today. Give the post office a chance to save itself. That's what we're doing here. We're giving rural communities a chance to fight and to be part of a growing economy. We're giving small businesses the opportunity to stay in business. Don't cut them off today. Let this debate go forward, because we are trying to do the right thing, the right fiscally responsible direction. And I see the colleague from Massachusetts who's been a very able leader on in our efforts.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to the gentle lady that just spoke regarding this very important issue. This is something that it's ratepayer costs. It's not taxpayer dollars. It's something that we've been working on now for a couple of months, and all of a sudden here we are at the end hour, and everyone's saying, oh, by the way, you know, we can't do it. Bottom line is, if we don't do this and we don't pass it, we're not going to have a post office. This is something that you know, we recognize there's a new business environment that the Postal Service operates under, but one that is focused on sustainment. And if we don't give them the tools to actually do that, then we are going to be losing the post office. And you know, there's a misconception somehow out there that there's a bailout going on. These are dollars that are ratepayer dollars. They're not taxpayer dollars. And our bill does not prevent the Postal Service from making changes or streamlining operations, but ensures that it rolls out changes in a deliberate and responsible manner. It's fair to the employees, give postal customers the ability to continue to use the service, provide short-term relief without taxpayer funding. That FERS overpayment between $7 and $10 billion, part of which we can help to reduce the workforce without even blinking. It's a no-brainer, and that provides long-term relief as well. Curbside delivery, administrative efficiencies, various other reforms, retiree health care restructuring. It focuses on its primary attention on the primary cost, the workforce cost, and the controversial postal closures, the 5-day, 6-day. Listen, both sides are highly charged in these issues, and I certainly understand that. Had they been involved in the conversations, the upwards of 400 hours between staff and members working on these things, we could have actually worked through those instead of waiting to once again, the end hour to get on these issues. But once again, I am with the Lieberman, Carper, Collins, obviously, and
in my effort to continue to move this bill forward so we can have a good conversation about how to reestablish that trust between the American ratepayer, taxpayer, and the Postal Service. We need to do this. It's very, very important for us to do this today. We need to move on and focus on the things that matter, and this matters. I want to make sure that I can send my mom a card. I want to continue to make sure that we can continue to keep our people employed. I want to make sure we have an institution that's going to be viable into the next century. So I would hope that we would move forward, and I yield the floor.
President, very briefly, I thank Senator Brown from Massachusetts for his statement, all his work on the bill. This point of order puts the whole bill in jeopardy. It right at the beginning of the debate and the votes, forces members to decide whether they want to deal with this crisis in the Postal Service. And I think it tests Congress again, in this case the Senate. Are we going to face a real problem in one of the iconic areas of American public service, the Postal Service, which can't continue to do business as it is now? And this bill will force it to change in ways that are significant, but will still keep it alive. Or are we going to turn away from the problem, which would be the effect of sustaining this point of order? It would also cut off the debate. We got 39 amendments pending. This bill may change as the debate goes on. The final vote on passage of the bill will require 60 votes. So don't cut it off now. Let us have this debate and prove to the American people that we can take on a problem and on a bipartisan basis fix it. I urge my colleagues to vote for the motion to waive the...
Mr. President. Mr. President. Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Who's it? Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, I think there's merit in the discussion about whether we vote now or vote later. The important thing is that we vote on this budget point of order. But it's not as if the entire process of trying to fix the post office is going to collapse if we take this vote and it succeeds. All we're asking is that we find a way to pay for it. And this Senate agreed last August in the Budget Control Act that we were not going to exceed these limits, that we would find if there was something essential that needed to be done, and that's the case that's shortly to be made here, we would at least find a way to stay within what we had agreed to do. And this is the second time now, I believe, maybe more, that we have violated that agreement. And so what do we go home and tell our people? Well, this was so important to save some post offices that we had to violate an agreement which was agreed to by a strong majority here to save the country from default. And there are priorities. And it's impossible for me to understand that why we can't, in this government that spends over $3.7 trillion, we can't find a way to scare up $34 billion over a 10-year period of time to cover the cost that this bill is going to lay on us. And so I would urge, whether we vote now or vote later on the senator from Alabama's point of order, that we consider this. And we've got a recess week coming up. The staff can go together and dig out $34 billion of cost savings that we can apply to this, and then we don't have to worry about going home and telling people we didn't keep our word. We lied to you in August.
Senator from Oklahoma.
My colleagues, I sat on this committee. I voted on the last postal reform bill. I'm not unfamiliar with the issues. I think the question before us is, why can't we do both? Why can't we fix the post office and pay for it at the same time if, in fact, the CBO says that? And our answer always up here is, we want to fix the post office, but we don't want to make the hard choices on how to do that. And my colleagues have done great work. There's parts of this bill I don't agree with. I'm trying to amend parts of it. I think we ought to move forward with it. But the ultimate question is, will we do what's best for the post office and the American people? And doing what's best for the post office and the American people is any cost that the CBO says it will violate the budget agreement, we ought to pay for. And I will offer right now to come up with easy ways to pay for this bill just through the duplication reports that we've gotten from the Government Accountability Office. We all know that it's out there. We all know there's $100 billion at least that we could come up with by consolidating programs or mandate that they be consolidated. So it's not a matter of not finding the money. It's a matter of whether or not we have the will. We're on a course of collision with history that would say we're not going to succeed if we don't get our budgets under order. So I agree it's hard to stomach sometimes what the CBO tells us. It doesn't fit with common sense. But when it works for us, we use it. When it works against us, we say it doesn't matter. The point is they've said this is a budget point of order, and I think we can do both, and I think we ought to do both. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, let me repeat to my colleagues one more time. There are no taxpayer dollars authorized by this bill or appropriated by this bill. The score is caused by the unique status that the Postal Service accounts have within the unified budget. The operational accounts are off budget. The employee health benefits and retiree accounts are on budget because those accounts are also used by federal agencies. Let me again quote from the Inspector General, who explains this system very well. He says the source of the federal employee retirement funding comes from two streams of revenue. First, the U.S. Postal Service contributes 11.9% of the employees' salaries to the fund, and the employees contribute 0.8%. The Postal Service contribution comes from revenue paid for postage, and this money comes from ratepayers. The employee contribution is made in exchange for a defined benefit. There are no tax dollars authorized or appropriated by this bill. It is a quirk of the way the unified budget works. And that is why we should vote to waive this point of order. We are not talking about taxpayer dollars here. Thank you, Mr. President.
The question is on the motion to waive the point of order by the senator from Alabama. The yeas and nays are ordered. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. DeMint. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer,
No.
Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby,